I've asked this question of, several candidates that have come on in the past. It's puts you in a difficult position because obviously you can't predict the future, and all you can really have is the promises that, of course, any politician could renege on the second they're in office. But there are certain moments that have emerged that were these tells, these moments where it became clear the difference between lip service and what people were willing to do when the things got tough. And asking folks about what they would have done in those moments has become a little bit of a litmus test, rightly or wrongly, for folks on the left. Because the real test is this: are you willing to truly be adversarial to the party apparatus, given how threatening and genuinely coercive it can be? When AOC is crying on the House floor because of whatever Nancy Pelosi said to her to get her to change her Iron Dome vote, I don't think that AOC is someone with a weak constitution or who is just a big crybaby or, doesn't have ethics. I think that she was pressured in some way that is really pretty significant and meaningful. And so what people want to know is, if that force of the hammer comes down on you, if something happens like what Bakari Sellers is doing and raising $1 million in a super PAC intentionally to prevent to challenge progressives with corporate candidates, if you have the forces aligned against you the way they did AIPAC and all of those kinds of PACs against Nina Turner, are you going to be willing to say, Cory Bush, Cory Bush didn't do, I, McKayla Wilkes, am willing to go ahead and buck the party leadership and endorse Nina Turner? Are you willing to go ahead and not vote for additional funding to the Iron Dome? Are you willing to say, I will not vote for Nancy Pelosi to be Speaker of the House?
Absolutely. Unequivocally, without a doubt, I absolutely would. And that's actually, I was speaking with someone the other day, and we were kind of talking about how, a lot of, some of the progressives in office tend to support, Democratic primary challengers kind of in safe races, so to say. Mm-hmm. Like Jessica Cisneros, she got so many endorsements, from a lot of people that, a lot of us look up to. But, because of, Henry Cuellar and being against abortion access, abortion rights, because that is kind of like the safe controversial topic. Where something like Medicare for All, a Green New Deal, canceling student debt, it's all controversial. There is no safe controversial issue to challenge. And so that is where I would see myself being differentiated, because I think that we should be uplifting every single Democratic primary challenger that is running against someone who is an incumbent, whether they are a Republican or a Democrat, whether they are running against someone who is who supports, a controversial issue, a controversial policy, when they're all controversial. Like, this is what we're up against, and we can't be afraid to call out Democratic leadership, because when we're running for office, we're calling them out by name. But then once we're elected, we're only referring to them as Democratic leadership. Who are you talking about? Name them.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a really good point. A lot of people saw, AOC during her race say things like, I don't understand why Nancy Pelosi, is Speaker of the House. And then do something that was pretty courageous, but just to have this sit-in at her office on her first day in Congress. And then see what feels like a real change of tone over the course of a number of years. And, they're worried about falling into the trap with other future candidates who might similarly be influenced in those ways. One question that I get a lot, and that a lot of the listeners are curious about, is how do you find support to stand your ground, to stick the landing when there are so many other pressures afoot? And when there is also this pressure that I don't think we on the left talk about or acknowledge enough, which is that a lot of electeds, I think, especially those who are representing, marginalized districts or districts that have a disproportionate number of marginalized people in them, they feel as though it is important for me to stay in office because even if I'm not getting these big ticket items, I can see now that I'm here that I am able to have a direct effect on the lives of all of these poor and working people. And even though I'm compromising and even though I'm getting, yelled at on the House floor, what have you, I suddenly see more value in keeping my seat than making this stand that could highlight the toxic rot in the core of the Democratic Party. And therefore, I'm not going to be adversarial in the ways that I represented I would be when I came into office. How do you see yourself as being able to stick that landing and stay adversarial and not succumb to the idea that incrementalism is worth the compromise?
I think that, from what you just said, it sounds like, if you have that kind of mentality, it's more about you, just staying there to be elected again. Because if you're in there and you say, and I were to be like, I have to be here because at least we're getting a little bit. We've already been getting a little bit. We've already been getting breadcrumbs. And so it's like, essentially, you're staying there to do the very thing that made you want to run in the first place, because nothing is changing incrementally. There is no point for me to be there if I can't help the marginalized people or, the other people in my community in a fundamental way. Me being there is pointless. If I'm not if I'm not in there fighting as hard as I can to make sure that everyone has healthcare, if I'm not in there taking a stance to make sure that we don't achieve environmental justice, economic justice, racial justice, if I'm not in there and I am not fighting for affordable housing and nothing is fundamentally changing in my district, if people in my community are not seeing tangibles, what am I doing there?
Well, can you tell me a little bit about your district? What's going on in Maryland's 5th?
Mm-hmm. So in our district, there's a lot going on. So we just went through redistricting, which is really cool. We have a more favorable district. But in our district, like in Prince George's County, I think it was like the county council had passed some kind of resolution for universal health care, in favor of universal health care. And so the political landscape in our district is shifting. The demographics in our district are shifting. And more people are becoming aware. More people are paying attention to what is going on in our communities, because finally people are like, what the hell is going on? Like, nothing is changing. Like, we still have homeless communities. We have tent communities out here. We have the working poor. I can't tell you how many people I've met that have full-time jobs but have to sleep outside. The rent is going up. In my county, on its own, they just basically increased property taxes, which is going to affect homeowners and renters. People's rents are going up. We still don't have any kind of rent control here. And here we are, represented by the majority leader, right? And someone who works 20 minutes outside of your district. It's not like you work in DC and you represent California. Like, your district is right here. And so you have to drive from DC to Maryland and see the tent communities. You have to drive down 301 from DC to Maryland, and you have to see the people on the side of the road holding up signs saying that they're hungry. This is what's going on in our district. We have sacrifice zones. In Brandywine, Maryland, there is a population that is over 70% Black, and there are 5 power plants within 1 to 3 miles radius of residential communities and public schools, and in the Black community in our district. And that's what we're facing.
So for people who don't know, you're running against Steny Hoyer, who is no friend to the left. He's been gracing the pages of lefty magazines. I remember we were covering a breaking news of a leaked tape with him back when I was at The Intercept in 2018. People should go and familiarize themselves with his long record of being antagonistic to the interests of the left. But specifically, what should people know as they're weighing whether or not to invest in this race about the kind of policies he supported and objected to during his tenure?
Yeah. So I always say this all the time, but I talk about how folks talk about Mitch McConnell's graveyard, but we don't talk about Steny Hoyer's graveyard. And the many progressive policies that he has not put on the floor for a vote, even including a Green New Deal, which isn't even a bill, it's a resolution to get the conversation started of how do we achieve environmental justice, and how do we get to a cleaner, more, environment with clean air and clean water. It's those simple things. Well, to me, they're simple. They're basic human rights. And then we look at a lot of the things that he does approve of. For interest, I said for interest. For instance, like how every single year the defense budget gets historically high. But yeah, we don't have that same energy with our public schools. We don't have that same energy to fully fund the Section 8 program, which could, essentially end homelessness, granted if you widen the eligibility requirements and things like that. And then, we look at how, I'm pretty sure he's one of the folks that supported sending funding over to the Ukraine. When we have, Black and brown people who are currently still to this day being arrested and detained for simply seeking asylum for safety. Not too long ago, we had Black Haitians being whipped at the border by Border Patrol agents riding horses. But these are the things that we're focusing on. We're someone who supports anti-BDS legislation. When our civil rights movement is founded on free speech. And so like this is what we're up against. Someone who supported every single crime bill that was ever written, that increased police presence in Black communities, that increased funding for school police officers in public schools, which feeds the school to prison pipeline for Black and brown children, that allowed for stop and frisk to happen, that allowed for mandatory minimums to happen. That is the reason for the mass incarceration of Black and brown people in this country. Like, this is what we're fighting against. Like, this is the person.
So what do you make? I'm curious. We're now, by the time people listen to this, a week/3 weeks out from 2 mass shooting events and a day out from, I think, 3 more just happened around the country. And some people think that this might be a sea change moment in the conversation around gun control. But if not gun control, the events in Uvalde specifically have shown a spotlight on police misconduct that few, even the most zealous Blue Lives Matter flag bumper sticker type, has a hard time of celebrating the first responders in Uvalde. What do you make of how the Democratic Party is, using this political moment? And what, if anything, would you like to see them do differently? Or what would you do differently if you were in Congress in terms of messaging around what's been happening these last few weeks?
Yeah. Well, for one example, I wouldn't be on vacation, right after it happened. But I think that this is, a time where we need to start talking about meaningful gun control. Maryland has fairly reasonable gun control policies here, but it would be nice to be expanded throughout the entire country.
So what kind of things do you have in Maryland that are adopted more broadly that you think might be useful?
As far as like the extensive background checks and, a lot of the things that progressives are fighting for on the federal level to have, the training, the classes, I've already said like the background checks and things like that are already in place here in Maryland, but they could be improved and also broadened on the federal level across the entire country. But gun laws aside, this is also a time to start talking about the funding of our public schools, right? About not solely not heavily depending on property taxes. But like I said earlier, having that same energy as we do with the defense contractors and the Department of Defense with our public school system, but have funding that is specifically for the infrastructure of schools. And when I say that, we have some schools in our district, like my son's school that he went to last year. Their infrastructure was completely different. You can't even enter the building. There are one-sided doors with handles where you can't get in unless you are physically let into the building. There's a foyer area with the big, like a big like bulletproof glass thing, steel doors. You can also implement those doors on classrooms, that have handles that are only accessible from the outside or, something like that, from the inside. But talking about school infrastructure, for one, is good for, to handle people coming into the school. Like when we see these mass shooting that just happened in Texas, imagine if they wouldn't have even been able to make it inside of the building. But it also helps with the fact of, it helps to also dismantle the school to prison pipeline also. Like, because when we're speaking with people in the community about the school to prison pipeline and police officers in schools, armed police in schools, one of their main go-tos is, what if there's a mass shooter? What if someone comes into the building? Well, what if we invested in our public schools infrastructure to where no one that isn't supposed to be there is able to enter the building?
I mean, what do you make? Because a lot of people have been making fun of Ted Cruz's emphasis on infrastructure changes, perhaps not the same ones you're talking about, but the idea of only having one door. He went on this whole one door, whole door, Game of Thrones style rant that people were really dragging across the internet. And people perceive that to be a deflection from the issue of why we have more guns in this country than people, why America with whatever 15% of the world's population or whatever we are have, half of the world's guns. And, do you see a conflict between those two topics, those two approaches?
Yeah, it doesn't make sense to have one door. For one, that's not safe for anyone. It's not safe and it's not feasible. Like, how long would it take for people to even enter the building if you only have one door? So yeah, there definitely is conflict. Yeah, it doesn't make sense to have one entrance. That's not safe for anyone. But what we can do is, like I said, invest in the infrastructure to make the entire building safe. Because having one door, when you have a bunch of windows or whatever, it doesn't make sense.
Right, well, some people might also say, are we turning schools into prisons? Is the idea that you can't go in and out of these buildings, that they're increasingly fortified, that kids are having to go through metal detectors, and that there are these school resource officers standing around armed and largely ineffective? Is there something really toxic about a society where that has to be how schools are designed, and is continuing to fortify schools, evading the fundamental cultural problem, gun culture problem, violence problem, potentially mental health problem, and everything else? Is that just, is it ultimately sidestepping the main issue?
I think if we're only going to do that, like if we're only going to focus on the infrastructure of schools, then absolutely yes. Are schools built like jails? Yes. As someone who's been in a juvenile detention facility, it is. But I think that if we can't just focus on the infrastructure. There are a bunch of things that intersect when we talk about gun reform laws, and when we talk about why do we have more guns than people in this country. Why are we living off of a document that was created in the 1700s that's allowing for this to be possible? And so we have to talk about all of the intersectionalities collectively, because we can't just focus on, that one aspect of just the infrastructure of the schools, because there is a lot that goes into this. Like, who's raising, these people, these white supremacists and these other people who are committing these acts? What resources did they lack? Why is our country breeding, all of these kinds of people? Like, for instance, the United States has I think I saw over 70% of the world's serial killers. Why is that? There is definitely something toxic.
Why is that, McKayla? Because obviously I don't expect you to solve the world's problems right here, but a lot of people have their theories, and I have found myself personally a lot more open to a multi-pronged approach than I might have been in recent years, where I kind of saw everything that wasn't gun control as a pretext to not talk about gun control. And oftentimes it is. But I do think it might be the case that even if we do a lot of gun control measures, we're not going to turn into some of these countries that have no gun violence. It will help. It will meaningfully diminish the number of mass shootings and other kinds of gun-related homicides that we have here, and suicides. But there's something in addition to that also needs to be addressed. And you alluded to it just then when you talked about, the resources that these families have. Of course, the Buffalo incident was an explicit white supremacist who talked about how his participation in video game chat rooms started feeding him with a certain level of indoctrination that he found to be appealing. The most recent shooter in Uvalde, it is from a Latino community, and the victims were all, I think, all Latino, if not overwhelmingly so. And there's some questions about, what the intersection between, whether white supremacy is a neat enough answer for all of these different disparate cases. But I wonder what you make of it, and from a potential prospective legislator's point of view, would you be open to like a broader range of interventions, and what would you be doing in Congress right now in the wake of these tragedies?
Yeah, I absolutely think that there is a more broader way to be able to intervene. And I think it comes from right now, like as things are, our society is completely reactionary. Like even when, we depend on the police for safety, they're completely reactionary. Like even with the white supremacist that went to Buffalo, he was able to travel hundreds of miles with a loaded weapon after having all these conversations on social media and not be stopped by the police once. Mm-hmm. The same with the Texas shooter, was able to go almost 100 miles and not be stopped at even one time. But people who look like me and you, I can't go like 15 minutes outside of my house without getting pulled over by the police. And so I think it also comes from not having that same energy, and it also goes to show how the police don't keep us safe. They're not doing their jobs, or their quote unquote jobs, what they're supposed to be doing. Because if they were being more proactive and actually trying to keep the community safe, then instances like this could be prevented, especially when people are saying they're going to do it on social media. They're saying they're going to do it with their friends, telling their friends that they're going to do it. They're writing 180-page manifestos and posting it on Facebook the day before. But none of that was caught.
Hey, YouTube. Thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.